Okay. Well, thank you all for joining our quarterly NASEO Manufactured Housing Energy Efficiency and Affordability Task Force meeting. To date, most of these sessions have only included state and territory energy office attendees, but we're today excited to be opening this up to a broader audience of NASEO affiliate members and engaged stakeholders on the line. So really appreciate you all joining us today. We did hold a states and territories only manufactured housing task force webinar on the feasibility of heat pump adoption for manufactured homes back in February of this year. During that session, we heard perspectives from Northwest Energy Works, Mitsubishi, and Johnson Controls. And this session, we also got to hear a bit from the Maine Governor's Office on the Maine whole home electrification heat pump deployment efforts. So that was really great. And a teaser that has now queued up a presentation today from Efficiency Maine on further details on program implementation. And then along with that perspective from Maine, we're also excited today to hear from the Oregon Department of Energy on the Oregon Rental Home Heat Pump Program, which offers a carve out for manufactured homes on rental plots in manufactured home parks. And then we're also really thrilled today to be able to close out the webinar with a presentation from the Florida Solar Energy Center on a residential energy retrofit emerging tech solution that's currently being demonstrated on manufactured homes. So let me just share my screen really quickly so that we have the slide. And the slide with the agenda here. So our presenters today are Dan Mistro, the Strategic Initiatives Manager from Efficiency Maine Trust, Patrick DePriest, Energy Policy Analyst from the Oregon Department of Energy, and Eric Martin, Program Director with the Florida Solar Energy Center. So we'll be hearing from them in that order and capping off this presentation with a Q&A session that folks can feel free to contribute to within the chat and go off mute during that session at the end. So without further ado, I will admit everybody in the waiting room and hand it off to Dan.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Mistro. I'm a Strategic Initiatives Manager at Efficiency Maine, and I'm here to talk to you about what I think is one of our most exciting pilots we're doing in heating whole homes with heat pumps, and specifically the manufactured portion of that pilot. We have over 62,000 manufactured homes in the state of Maine, which makes up about 8% of our housing stock. These homes are all heated with kerosene, oil, or propane for the most part, with the vast majority actually being kerosene. Regardless of the fuel, all of these units are only about 80% efficient, have a COP of roughly 0.8, and the people who live in these homes tend to be more economically stressed occupants. It's a challenge to electrify manufactured homes due to a lack of industry experience, not necessarily with heat pumps themselves. We've installed over 100,000 heat pumps in Maine in the last couple of years, but manufactured homes are fundamentally different than stick-built homes. One example is the water lines that run under the homes are kept warm by warm air going through the ducts to prevent frozen pipes. They also have small HVAC closets that utilize that ductwork and 100 amp panel capacities. Targeting the low-hanging fruit in our state to date. I'm talking about single-wide manufactured homes throughout this presentation. So that's the smaller version of the manufactured homes in comparison to the double-wide. You can see a schematic of that single-wide home up top. You can see the furnace right in the middle that we're going to be replacing in this pilot. And all the single-wide homes that we targeted were in the southern to central part of the state. Climate zone 6A, 5B, and 5A, which is representative of a large proportion of the country. All the homes that participated in our pilot were heated with kerosene, oil, or propane. They all had a fully intact underbelly. They were all owner-occupied, They met whatever income screening requirements we had at the time. And most importantly, they had the ability to fit an appropriately sized heat pump and any necessary supplemental electric resistance in both that furnace closet and on the electric panel. The screening criteria we used in order to approve the participants in this pilot was first a manual J calculation for all homes. We completed the full heat load for these homes, and anything with more than 37,000 BTUs of heat loss were referred to a weatherization program instead. But otherwise, we wanted to use the homes exactly as they were. We used a blower door and duct blaster test for homes. We initially started with all homes, and we are seeing very consistent results with the newer homes, but we continue to monitor these for homes that are older than 2005. We also looked at the HVAC closet in these homes. You can see homes that are quite old might have a narrow closet, maybe 18 inches wide, when the newer homes are generally wider and easier to fit a heat pump into. We did an electrical code calculation for all home to ensure that it met all local building codes and that the heat pump can actually fit on that panel without exceeding the capacity, as well as any supplemental electric resistance. And then the underbelly of the home was actually checked for signs of damage. We didn't want to install any heat pumps in a damaged home, and we referred to them to weatherization programs instead. So here's a picture of the solution that we're actually talking about. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen is the existing HVAC closet in this home. So there's a ducted heat pump installed in that space right now, and that is the exact same space that a kerosene furnace was operating in prior to our installation. So we utilized the same closets, the ductwork that was being used is still being used to warm every part of the home that was warmed before. You can see the schematic of the ductwork in the middle of your screen here. That air handler, the ducted air handler from the heat pump, is warming the pipes and keeping the pipes above freezing to prevent frozen pipes, just like the furnace was. And you can see on the right the outdoor unit supplying the heat to the home. We installed all of these outdoor units on physical pads rather than on the wall of the manufactured homes themselves to avoid any rattling that you might get bothering the occupants inside the home in this particular building type. We are entering our third year of this pilot. So we started this back in 2021. We had 10 homes that were recruited, and we wanted them to take a leap with us. We had not seen anyone replace delivered fossil fuel in manufactured home entirely with heat pumps before, and we wanted to make sure that we were making it as risk-free for these participants as possible. So we installed these heat pumps completely free of charge to all of our participants as in exchange for them letting us meter their homes throughout the winter. We also gave them a risk-free guarantee that if any time within the first year of participating, they did not like their heat pump and they wanted to go back to their previous heating system, we would come and reinstall their delivered fuel heating system. Luckily, none of them actually took us up on this, so all 10 of these heat pumps are actually still being used today. And it gave us confidence to launch phase 2 last year, where we added 19 additional manufactured homes. We did ask them to contribute a little bit financially to their installation. They received the unit for no money down, but they agreed to pay $50 a month for 50 months during a lease period in which they would receive a full parts and labor warranty in case something happened to their unit that Efficiency Maine paid for. But otherwise, after that 5 years, the repairs would be on them. They allowed us to meter their home throughout the winter, just like in the first phase, and it has gone quite well. We are planning on launching phase 3 exactly the same way as phase 2 throughout our low-income delivery team as opposed to a pilot, and also testing a couple of additional home types. We want to test some double-wide homes and some further north homes this year. I talk about metering the home. This is what we're actually looking at. We looked at the power at the unit, the amperage of the indoor fan, and the supply air temperature to get a good sense of how the heat pump was operating. We also looked at the return air temperature, the air actually coming back into the heat pump to have a sense of what the temperature inside the home was. So this first graph is a little bit messy, so I'm going to talk you through it slowly. This is one of our warmer climates in Freeport, Maine. This is still the coldest period that we got throughout our pilot. So this graph is looking at a 2-day period in February. February 3rd to 5th of this year, which is on your bottom axis. On the left-hand axis, we are looking at the compressor power in kW. And on the right-hand axis, we're looking at all the temperatures. So the first line I'll direct you to is the orange line at the bottom of the screen. That's the outdoor air temperature. So we can see during this 2-day period, it dropped down to about -10 degrees and stayed there for about a day. You can see from the compressor power, the light blue line right behind the orange, how often the compressor was actually running. When the compressor's not running is when the heat pump was cycling, not actually calling for heat. So you can see during the cold period, the compressor was running almost the entire time, but still not the entire time. The yellow supply air line at the very top of this graph shows that warm air is coming out of the heat pump anytime the heat pump is running. When it drops down is when the heat pump is cycling, but when it kicks back up is the actual temperature that is being provided throughout the home. Line that's right below that is the actual indoor air temperature that we can look at. We can see that even during this cold period, the home remained comfortable between 60 and 75 degrees throughout the entire period. And this is a heat pump operating completely by itself. There is no supplemental electric resistance installed at this site. So let's look at a slightly colder climate. So we're going to the central part of the state in Hancock, Maine. This is going to be during the same cold period. So we're looking at February 3rd to 6th of this year, and we just have temperature on the left. This heat pump was installed a few days before, so we didn't actually have compressor power installed at this site yet. But you can see that the outdoor air temperature in the bottom actually dropped down to -16 degrees. So quite cold. And the supply air temperature, the dark blue line at the top, was kicking out warm air throughout that entire period. And you can see this yellow line, this home liked it warmer than the other home. This heat pump was keeping the home between 70 and 80 degrees throughout that entire period. We did actually install electric resistance at this site. However, after this cold period, we found out that the electric resistance was improperly installed. So the electric resistance did not kick on at all during this period like it was supposed to. So while it was an accident, we did have a good opportunity to test how the heat pump could perform by itself. So you can see without any electric resistance, the heat pump still kept the home at a comfortable temperature throughout this period. So we're going to look at another house in Hancock a little bit later in the same month. So we can see the outdoor air temperature at the bottom dropping down to about 0 degrees, coming back up to the teens, dropping down to about 0 again throughout a 2-day period at the end of the month. We have temperature on the left-hand side, and we can see the supply air temperature, just like before, providing warm air throughout that period, cycling a couple of times, and the indoor air temperature of the home staying between 70 and 80 degrees. I want to look at that same period, but a slightly different way. So you can see that same outdoor air temperature at the bottom dropping down to 0 and back up throughout that 2-day period. You can see temperature is going to be on our left-hand axis, but now on our right-hand axis, we're going to have the COP of the unit and the kW of the compressor. So we can see during this cold period, anytime the compressor is running is when that power is actually moving up. It's consuming more energy. And then when it drops back down is when the heat pump is cycling. And when it drops down completely to 0, there's no heat being called for. So during this period, as you would expect, as it was cold, the heat pump would kick on and start running, but the COP that you're actually experiencing with that heat pump, even at these low temperatures, remain between 2 and 2.5. If you remember before, the existing fossil fuel furnaces that were there operate with a COP of about 0.8. So even if you consider high line losses, you would still about double the efficiency with these heat pumps at these very cold temperatures than they would have had with their existing fossil fuel. This is the last graph I want to show you. The red line is going to be the max heat pump COP from the manufacturer at each temperature. We can see that the max COP is when the heat pump is running at its fullest potential and when the COP would be lowest at these temperatures. On the green line is where we see the standard heat pump COP, as the heat pump is providing an amount of heat when it's operating at its normal capacities. You can see the COP that we observed from this house throughout about a month period stayed pretty well within this manufacturer stated COP. All of these little dots are 1-minute intervals. and it's tracking what we would expect to see from the COP quite remarkably. Few observations we had from the winter. The heat pumps successfully heated homes with no backup down to negative 16 degrees Fahrenheit with no issues. There was a home that did have ice slide off of its metal roof and encase the heat pump. It actually seized the unit during this period of time. So we had to go and clear that off the unit. Once we did clear the ice, the unit kicked right back up to normal. But that experience ended up in our best practices slide, which will be next. The heat pump appeared to operate at or near rated COP and provide heat at near capacities. And the actual heat loss was lower that we actually observed in the field than we calculated with our Manual J software. We would continue to use the Manual J software, but it was interesting and comforting to know that we had additional wiggle room to our Manual J calculations. So here's our best practices that we have learned so far in installing these units. Ice can slide off metal roof and encase or damage units. So it might be a best practice to put units on a gable end of the home, but it's also best to consider other environmental factors and airflow with those units. We recommend installing these on a ground stand rather than mounted on the siding for this building type because it would create a lot of noise if it was installed on the wall and bother the occupants inside. You might want to consider piping the condensation out of the skirting of the home. These installations are a little unique that you could install the condensate line coming through the underbelly of the home, but not beyond the skirting. And you might find that that would result in pools of condensation in the summertime when the cooling is actually running. But with that in mind, you want to consider your appropriate cabling for the environment as well. If you're going to introduce more moisture under the home, it would be worth considering a waterproof cable, like a UF rated cable over a water resistant Romex and M rated cable. The satisfaction for the study was quite high. I just threw a couple of quotes on here. People raved about how even the heat was and how well it performed even at low temperatures. Nobody had frozen pipes throughout the year, and we consider this pilot wildly successful. This is a question we get a lot about these installations, whether we include supplemental electric resistance. The short answer is some have, but not all. If we were able to fit it on the panel and their Manual J calculations called for it, we would install it. But if homes were not actually able to fit it on their electric panel, if they were able to have a heat pump large enough to heat their home, we didn't hesitate to install it without supplemental electric resistance. And then finally, I wanted to include all the heat pump units that we have installed in this pilot program. This is not a comprehensive list of all the units that would work, but it is the units that we have used. And I wanted to draw your attention specifically to that very first Daikin unit, as that one has a width of 17.5 inches. So the very old homes that have an 18-inch closet, that was the unit that we found that was able to fit in just about every case, as long as that 36 BTU capacity was adequate for the home.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. Now handing it off to Patrick from Oregon Department of Energy.
Thanks, Jasmine. My presentation will be a good bit less technical than what Dan provided for us. We have just kicked off our rental home heat pump program a month or so ago. So I'm mostly going to provide an overview of that program, why it came into being, and where we're at right now. But as Jasmine said, my name is Patrick DePriest. I'm an energy policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy. I've largely been supporting implementation of the two different state heat pump programs that were passed last year or created last year through a bill. Today I'm talking about the Oregon Rental Home Heat Pump Program. The other one is the Community Heat Pump Deployment Program, which is focused more on homeowners and on occupants. So I will also talk about the inclusion of manufactured homes in this program. as that's relevant to today. Great. I will go to the next slide. All right. Thank you. So in 2021, Oregon experienced a heat dome event that saw record high temperatures, during which at least 100 Oregonians died of heat-related illness, often in their own homes. So following this event, the legislature passed Senate Bill 1536 in 2022. And this bill had a number of components, including the appropriation of approximately $25 million for the creation of 2 incentive programs. The 2 that I mentioned before, the Community Heat Pump Deployment Program and the Oregon Rental Home Heat Pump Program. So while this bill does seek to improve energy efficiency of heating and cooling across the state, the driving purpose of the bill is to address public health concerns. So this, both of these programs provide for financial assistance for the purchase and installation of heat pumps in homes, but I'm going to talk more about the rental program, and you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So as mentioned before, this program in particular does target benefits to manufactured homes. Both manufactured homes and recreational vehicles located in a rented space are included among potential recipients for funds under this program. Similarly to Maine, the manufactured homes and RVs and other non-traditional housing types make up about 8% of Oregon's housing stock. These dwellings are often less insulated, poorly sealed, leading to higher energy use intensity, and meaning that much more heating and cooling is required to maintain a comfortable temperature within the home. Some other reasons that the benefits are targeted to manufactured homes include that existing heating systems in these homes are often furnaces or electric resistance heat, which is one of the least efficient ways to provide heat. And so replacing those systems with heat pumps can result in significant energy savings. In addition to this, much of the manufactured homes in Oregon are aging and less energy efficient for that reason as well. We do want to note that adding cooling to a home can create additional energy cost and burden, energy and cost burden. However, if cooling is added via heat pumps, residents do get the benefits of adding cooling to the home and the energy savings for more efficient heating. So that can help minimize the monthly utility bill cost impact of adding cooling to homes. So these homes can be situated on land that is owned by the resident or in a rented space. This allows for residents of the manufactured homes to be served by both of our state heat pump programs, since the other one is focused on owner occupants. And that's it for that slide. So I'll provide a quick overview of this program now. Of the 25 million, about 15 million was allocated in the bill to the rental home heat pump program. For this program, contractors applied directly to the Department of Energy to reserve rebates for heat pump installations, as well as grants for upgrades, which related upgrades to the installation, which could include things like ductwork, replacing an electrical panel, and other upgrades. We opened the program to start approving contractors in June, and then opened the rebate reservation application last month in July. So contractors can now apply to be approved contractors, and then once approved, they can request funds to be reserved for these installations. Once they complete the installations, they can come back to Odo to request payment for those installations. That's it for that one. This slide gives you an overview of the financial incentives available under the program, which can vary depending on the dwelling type, installation costs, the income of the tenant, and whether the selected heat pump meets higher efficiency standards. So the rules for this program create kind of 2 tiers of efficiency within heat pumps, somewhat following federal standards, and so heat pumps meeting the higher tier can receive a higher rebate. And then you can also see how the rebates might play out under different scenarios. So for manufactured homes, they are eligible for higher rebates than traditional rental dwellings. And the slide provides sort of an idea of it can be up to 5,000 for a regular rental unit or up to 7,000 for an RV or manufactured dwelling, or 80% of the purchase cost, whichever one is lower. And then there's a cap of 4,000 depending on the income level of the tenant for the related upgrades grants. I will also mention that these rebates can be stacked with other rebates from other organizations such as Energy Trust of Oregon, the Bonneville Power Administration, or other federal programs, as long as those incentives don't exceed, of course, 100% of the cost of installation. Okay, that's it for that one. And this is my last slide, so I just wanted to provide a quick update on where we are. We are neck deep in dealing with and processing these reservation requests as quickly as we can. Right now we have 83 approved contractors across the state. The representation is pretty good throughout the different regions of the state. Obviously, some of the rural areas in Eastern Oregon could use additional contractor representation. And that's just a general challenge of getting heating and cooling systems to people in rural areas in the state. There's been nearly 500 reservation requests, 33 of which have been for manufactured homes, and nearly 15 million has been reserved to date. And that's it, just really an overview of how the program has kicked off, and I can answer questions later.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick. And any questions that audience members might have, feel free to drop those in the chat and we can circle back on those after Eric rounds out the presentations. But up next we have Eric Martin from FSEC. We have also a contact email from Patrick. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Jasmine. Hi, everybody. Eric Martin from the Florida Solar Energy Center. We're a research institute of the University of Central Florida. Going to give you a quick overview of our residential deep energy retrofit solution we're working on that we call PV GEMS. It features somewhat of an innovative approach to deploying and installing heat pumps in existing homes. We're going to be demonstrating this approach in several manufactured homes in various climates over the next couple of years. We're working with a few different partners, including REAM, to help us with some technical development of the solution. We're working with Resident-Owned Communities Association that's helping us recruit some occupied homes that we can conduct our demonstrations on. We're also working with NASEO that's overseeing some tech-to-market planning activities that we're undertaking in parallel to the demonstrations to think about how we might commercialize this technology and deploy it at scale. So the project that we have is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Advanced Building Construction Initiative. This initiative is looking to find innovative ways to deploy deep energy retrofits at scale by leveraging industrialized construction techniques that can help us deploy retrofits quickly with minimal disruption to the building occupants. So this image here that I grabbed from the fact sheet that's linked in the lower left-hand corner of the slide shows a panelized factory-built overclad system that's kind of universally applicable to a number of different building types in this area. And so it's got a really high R value, can be installed quickly with minimal disruption, and does a good job at minimizing the heating and cooling load on the building. Our solution is a little bit different, and we're thinking about the challenge when you're faced with a limited opportunity to get significant load reduction through enclosure upgrades. And so cases where you only have opportunity for minimal enclosure upgrades happen in a couple different scenarios. One is in the manufactured housing sector, where we often see deferral of traditional retrofits like weatherization services because of commonplace need for high-cost structural repairs that need to be done in order to accommodate the enclosure retrofits. We also see some challenges in this space with being able to replace the equipment in the home with high efficiency equipment. Dan talked a little bit about the furnace closets and the limited width there, limiting the availability of high efficiency equipment. We've also found it difficult to replace tank water heaters with heat pump water heaters, which are actually quite large. The image there shows some results from a study done in Oregon where they try to squeeze these larger heat pump water heaters into manufactured homes, which results in higher installation costs due to lack of space. You know, we have seen some success when we can overcome these challenges by accomplishing retrofits at scale and retrofitting most of the homes within a community through close proximity weatherization. So when we can overcome challenges, there are opportunities to retrofit a number of homes within a community kind of in one shot. So in addition to challenges with manufactured housing, we also see opportunities for only minimal enclosure upgrades, oftentimes with just single family detached in general that are in mild climates where, you know, the cost of doing a deep energy retrofit on the enclosure is really not supported by the energy savings that you're going to get. So again, you're focusing a little bit more on an equipment-based solution. Next slide, please. So what we've been looking at is essentially taking high efficiency heat pumps for space conditioning and water heating. We're partially powering that equipment with a modest solar and battery system. I'll explain that in a minute. But one of the innovations that we're working on is the ability to pre-package these components in a pod that's largely assembled off-site and then can be delivered to the site and hooked up somewhat quickly, easily, with minimal disruption of the occupants. You know, the size of the pod itself could be customized for differing situations. For example, if we're putting the photovoltaic modules on the roof of the pod, or if we're able to put them on the roof of the house. But we're pretty much going with the notion of installing the PV on the roof of the pod, kind of like the image you see in the upper left. If you click through, Jasmine, as we're going to be doing these demonstrations, we're also conducting some commercialization visioning in parallel to think about what an enclosure pod may look like for a commercialized version of PV GEMS. But in the end, the goal is to be able to largely assemble these pods off-site, deliver them to the site, maneuver them in place, and hook them up as quickly and easily as possible. So in addition, as we're installing the PV GEMS pod, we are taking advantage of any opportunities to conduct some shallow retrofits that are cost effective in the home. So this would include duct sealing, envelope sealing, and ceiling insulation type upgrades. So as I mentioned, the PV GEMS system is based off of heat pumps for space conditioning and water heating. So we're using a heat pump water heater that replaces the home's existing water heater. Then we've got a couple different options for space conditioning heat pumps. Most of the demonstrations we're going to be doing involve a small capacity ductless mini split around the 1 ton capacity that's really designed to supplement a home's existing space conditioning system, handle as much of the load as it can, but rely on the existing system for peak. We're also working on a second version, version B, that you see in the image there, that would enable us to have a slightly larger capacity system that enables a whole home centrally ducted heat pump replacement, similar to what Dan showed in his presentation. In all the cases, we're using a newer class of hybrid inverters that allow us to power these components specifically through a dedicated load panel with available energy from a modest photovoltaic and battery system. Basically, the inverters stabilize the load, first prioritizing any energy that's available from renewable sources like PV, and then make up the balance with energy from the grid. These systems, the batteries in these systems are optional. However, we do include them to store any excess PV energy we generate because the systems are being configured to not be connected to the grid and not feed back any energy to the grid, use all the energy on site. And this avoids the added cost and hassles that we experience sometimes with interconnection agreements. Next slide, please. So we've been working on this concept for a number of years. In phase one, we constructed some pilot systems in some of our full-scale laboratories we have on campus. These systems were not pre-packaged in nature. You can see the PV systems were ground mounted there, and we installed all the other components actually internal to the laboratories. But it enabled us to collect some data on what potential savings we could achieve with this type of system. Next slide. We use that data to calibrate some Energy Plus simulations and look at heating, cooling, and water heating energy savings in different locations around the country. In general, found that the system can provide for anywhere between 50 to 90% savings for those particular end uses. The buildings that we built and modeled came from NREL's residential housing stock characterization software, ResStock, and we had a couple of different versions of the buildings in each climate, a couple different vintages, pre-1990 and post-1990, and then we ran the simulations with a number of different existing central heating systems, and this is what accounts for the variation in the savings that you see there. Next slide. So moving forward, what we're currently working on are demonstrations in a number of different climates. We're looking at 2 homes in each of the 6 different climate areas that you see here in the table, working with the Resident-Owned Communities Association to help us recruit demonstration sites within manufactured housing communities. 8 of the 12 demonstrations we're planning to be manufactured homes. We're looking at a potential for 4 demonstrations in just market rate single family, just to demonstrate the wide applicability of this particular technology. While the goal of PV Gems is to pre-package this off-site and ship it to the site, we don't really have a factory yet that can do that. So most of these demonstrations will be site assembling all the components in the pod rather than being able to build it off-site. But we're going to try in at least 1 or 2 cases to construct PV Gems pods at our facility at the Solar Energy Center and put those on a truck and ship them to the sites. Next slide. So what we're working on now is we're converting the pilot system that was in our manufactured housing facility on site into a pod-based system. We're about to accept delivery of the enclosure. We've been working with a company called Tough Shed that manufactures sheds, and they're working with us on design, installation, and permitting of these systems. We're hoping to be able to work with this company for the demonstrations in all the climate zones, because as you can see in the map there, this company serves 48 of the 50 states with their product, and they actually have a partnership with Home Depot where they contract with independent installers to get these said sheds set up, and we're hoping to maybe be able to work with Home Depot to provide some of the other services for installation of the other components with PV Gems. Next slide. Okay, wrapping up. So just some additional parallel activities that we're working on in parallel to the demonstrations to look at deploying the technology at scale. As I mentioned, working with some of our partners on some further technical development, including looking at the commercial enclosure design, finalizing some details of our system controller, and then optimizing the hybrid inverter that we're using for the photovoltaic modules. Click through again. As I mentioned, we're working with NASEO on tech-to-market planning to really break down the barriers that we're going to come up against in terms of bringing this product to market and deploying at scale. So considerations like financing, incentives, manufacturing, marketing, sales. And we're going to be doing this through the assembly of a deployment task force that's going to be made up of a number of different stakeholders that might have an interest in seeing this technology get deployed. And lastly, because this PV Gems system really cuts across lots of different mechanical disciplines, plumbing, electrical, air conditioning, solar, we do envision an eventual kind of turnkey sales and installation workforce. And so we'll be working with our in-house School of Simulation and Training to help develop some training for those eventual contractors. And lastly, just thank you. My email's there, and this includes a link to about a 10-minute video that goes into a little bit more detail about how this PVGEM system works, if anybody's interested.
Great. Well, thank you all so much, Dan, Patrick, and Eric, for those great presentations. Now we have around 15 minutes scheduled for any Q&A that will kind of kick off through the audience first. So any chat, feel free to contribute any questions into the chat or come off mute. But first and foremost, I just wanted to say, like, it's really exciting to hear about all the emerging tech and tech to market advances being made in order to deploy at a state level, electrification and efficiency solutions for such an important housing stock. And I think it's great to see like all the various approaches at the state level here. And I think one question that I think I'd like to pose to the group, perhaps starting with Patrick, is kind of the outreach that you all intend to do in order to kind of engage those households or end users that would most benefit from these programs. A lot of the programs as they currently stand do have like income eligibility components. So, reaching out to like the most rural or low income beneficiaries. So yeah, it'd be great to hear about all of your approaches to, or initial ideas even on that level of engagement.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. There has been outreach done both before the program and of course as we're kicking it off, because we have to continue to drum up interest and awareness around these programs. It's easy for a lot of these groups to, hear about an incentive program months or a year ago, and then it can just pass out of their minds. So you have to really be consistent about communicating the opportunity and providing on the ground information about how to actually get these incentives. So a few things that are, I think, specifically relevant to Oregon. One I sort of hinted at is there's, a big gap in the availability of services and contractors depending on where you are in the state. Eastern Oregon is particularly rural, and there is a lot less availability of these types of projects. There are contractors, but they're more few and far between. Another key community for us to reach are tribal members in the state. We have 9 federally recognized tribes here, and they are certainly a key target for the benefits of both of the state heat pump programs. So we are in direct contact with tribal governments and key contacts within their programs, particularly their housing programs. We've been in direct contact with. We've learned from them that they manage many rental units on their reservations, and they also provide home repair and update support for tribal members across the state. So trying to get in the room with them, talk to them about how they can, work to get contractors they work with approved for this work, and just help with any sort of planning efforts that they're unable to do based on lower capacity. And then in terms of going back to the availability of contractors in rural areas, while this program doesn't provide funding for workforce development, we are looking at how we can support that in other programs through the department, including for some of the federal funds that are coming in this area. So I think, right, the outreach is ongoing. It needs to be done early and often, as they say. I guess one more thing that I would talk about in terms of sort of a complexity of Oregon is that we have very different climatic conditions across the state, right? Like the coast is never really gets above 60 degrees, whereas a lot of Western Oregon is right more mild versus Eastern Oregon can be very hot and very cold. So there's different needs across the state to consider as well. And then the one thing that I was going to add right around reaching low income was that for this program, one of the challenges is getting the information to show low income eligibility, but we do have a broad amount of programs that can be used, whether that be tax information or inclusion in programs like SNAP or housing vouchers, that type of thing. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to reach those communities.
Great. That's super helpful. And then Dan, as you know, Maine has been kind of deeper in the weeds of administering your heat pump program. Like how have you all also conducted outreach, gotten the customer buy-in, where, in phase 2, you're getting, more participation than even phase 1. I think maybe something has to do, like it almost certainly has to do with like the success of the first program year, but like how is that kind of communicated within Maine?
A very useful connection to make are people in the local nonprofits or community members that have the ears of people in these communities. We had somebody who works for a nonprofit in southern Maine that provides discounted fuel to low-income homes, telling them about our program, handing out brochures for us. We reached out to some of the CAP agencies. We want to mail out to the actual heating assistance program list to make sure that the people who are the neediest are aware that this program exists for manufactured homes, and to see if we're able to provide this solution for them.
Great. And then Eric, I guess it's kind of the combined work of FSEG and NASEO to figure out this question for PV Gems, but how do you kind of envision consumer engagement going down for the wider deployment of this retrofit attempt?
In part, we're hoping that's going to happen through our partnership with the Resident-Owned Community Association that kind of, as Dan mentioned, is working with some of these communities in their associations and can filter the information down. That particular organization has, I think, 12 regional technical assistance providers that is, reaching out to communities to help provide technical assistance and financing for the residents to take over ownership of the community. So that's one way. We haven't really given too much thought about, that sort of outreach in a privately owned community, but we're thinking kind of a similar trickle-down approach.
Great. And I see a question in the chat here from Akane. Akane, you can feel free to come off mute to ask it as well or clarify anything. But it seems that she's interested in hearing from you, Eric, about the sizing of the systems, because, a lot of parks or manufactured or mobile home parks may be constrained in that way.
Mm-hmm. That's something we're going to find out as part of the demonstrations. Most of the communities that I've visited, many of the homes have sheds already. It's pretty common because the homes don't often have garages. So there are lots of sheds. Now, whether we can fit a second shed or we're going to be replacing the shed that exists, we're going to have to work through that. But from what I've seen in many cases, there is space. The size of the shed that we're looking at is smaller or similar in size to the sheds that I see there. I think one of the challenges is going to be orientation of the shed for proper solar orientation. So it's one thing to be able to fit it on the lot, but can we fit it so that we get adequate solar exposure? That's going to be the challenge. And that's why we'll also be thinking more about possibilities of putting the PV modules on the roof of the structure, or maybe even some other kind of ground mount type installations.
Awesome. And it sounds like you also have an offer to come and demonstrate in kind of those practices within California. So
We do have some TBD locations still, so maybe there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, and I can reach out to you separately about California.
Sure.
great. And then I also see a question here in the chat about whether, Eric, you can mention any incentives that might exist for, financing the installation of PV gems, whether that's in the works or whether there's already some ideas, or if that's something that's coming down the pike in state level program design.
Yeah, that's another area we want to work with NASEO on through our deployment task forces to identify all those incentives that we can layer together to reduce the first cost of the system. And so looking at equipment rebates that might be available through the federal sources, state sources, layering that with traditional weatherization type funding that might be available. So bringing the first cost down is one concern, and then looking at creative ways to finance the remaining cost. For example, maybe through some sort of on-bill financing, whether that's through partnerships with the local utility, or again at the community level, with the possibility of the communities kind of taking ownership of these PV GEMS modules and then financing them through the land lease costs that the residents are paying, and maybe these even serving as a small source of revenue, almost like in an ESCO type arrangement. So we will be looking at those sorts of opportunities.
Great. Yeah, glad to continue thinking through these with you as NASEO also gets more in the weeds on this project. I think there might be a few states on the line who don't have existing, heat pump deployment efforts within manufactured homes that are curious to learn, how to get those off the ground, whether it be through state or federal funding. I think Dan, as the Efficiency Maine program, or the Maine program through Efficiency Maine's implementation, expands into future pilot phases. Like what is kind of keeping those funded? I think Ross, who was able to join, I think for the first portion of this call, had alluded to the expansion potentially happening through like pursuit of and the funds coming through Inflation Reduction Act and IIJA. Is there anything that you have to weigh in on like the ability to kind of keep these programs afloat and keep the funding coming?
I'm going to look at Michael first to see if he wants to answer that question for us.
I thought that might happen. Good afternoon, everybody. I work with Dan at Efficiency Maine and have the pleasure of dealing with the funding side of the operation. So we are fortunate to have a couple of different funding streams that encourage us to think we're going to be able to continue this. Not the least of which is that this is considered now an electric efficiency measure through our utility funded programs. So provided that it proves to be cost effective, it will be factored into the budgets that we get funded through our utilities collected from ratepayers to fund energy conservation programs in the state, even if it involves fuel switching off of a delivered fuel to electricity. So that is the result of recently passed legislation called the Beneficial Electrification Policy Act here in Maine that was just passed last year. So that is going to be our longer term funding stream for doing these fuel switches where it's cost effective and will tend to decrease rates over time. In the shorter term, we also receive all of the revenues from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then, as Ross indicated, in the very next couple of year term, we're going to deploy a significant amount of the IRA rebate funds from the home electrification rebate program to to low income heat pump replacements, whole home heat pump replacements. It's possible that we won't use those dollars for these manufactured homes. It's seems more likely we got some grant funds from the BIL, and it seems more likely we'll use that for the single family homes. But I think when we look at multifamily homes, we'll probably be tapping into the IRA funds.
Great, thank you, Michael. Well, with 2 minutes remaining and not seeing anything new coming through the chat, I want to kind of open it up to Patrick, Dan, and Eric just to provide any closing remarks. And also appreciate you all for spending some time today and sharing about your respective electrification and efficiency deployment efforts. So any closing remarks from you all?
I'll just mention that I talked a little bit about the deployment task force that we're working with NASEO on. And if anybody's interested in serving on that committee and working with us to look at deploying these sorts of technologies at scale, let either me or Jasmine know, and we'll sign you up.
No closing remarks from me, but thanks for the opportunity to talk. Feel free to reach out if any of you have any questions that you'd like to reach out privately for.
Likewise, I appreciate being able to be here to speak today, but I don't have anything else to say.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us all, for our panelists and also our attendees on the line. And stay tuned for a follow-up email with recording and any notes dropped into the chat here. But yeah, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Bye.